Namaste. In this lecture, we will explore how human population growth, rising consumption, and ecological pressure interact. The central question we will work through is this: how does human demand reshape ecological systems? By the end of today's session, we should understand why human demand creates pressure on ecosystems, how that pressure operates through specific pathways, and what this means for biodiversity and long-term sustainability. Let us begin with a clear roadmap. We will first discuss how population growth increases the demand for ecological resources. We will then correct an important misunderstanding by showing that population is not the only factor and that consumption patterns matter greatly. After that, we will identify the main pathways through which human demand becomes ecological pressure. We will connect those pathways to biodiversity loss and declining ecosystem resilience. And finally, we will link the discussion back to sustainability and prepare for the next lecture on habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. A growing population generally requires more food, more water, more housing, more energy, and more raw materials. To meet these expanding needs, societies tend to expand agriculture, build more settlements, construct roads and dams, and intensify resource extraction. This does not automatically cause ecological damage in every situation, but pressure on natural systems tends to rise unless those systems are carefully planned and efficiently managed. Population growth increases the scale of demand, and scale matters in ecology because ecosystems are not limitless. They have carrying capacities, flow requirements, and structural limits that do not expand simply because human need grows. At the same time, environmental impact is not determined by numbers of people alone. It also depends on how much each person consumes. Per capita resource use varies widely across societies and income groups. A small population with very high consumption may place far greater ecological pressure than a much larger population with lower per capita use. So when we study biodiversity threats, we must examine both scale and lifestyle. If we focus only on population numbers, our analysis becomes too narrow. Both the number of people and the nature of their consumption patterns together determine the total ecological footprint. Let us make this distinction clearer. One society may have a large population but relatively low per capita use of energy, food, or materials. Another may have a smaller population but very high consumption per person. And both can create significant ecological pressure, but through very different patterns. The essential lesson is that ecological impact depends on the total pattern of demand, not on any single variable. Good environmental analysis must look at the scale, intensity, and the type of resources being used, rather than reducing the question to just one number. Let us now identify the main pathways through which human demand becomes ecological pressure. There are 5 prominent pathways. The first is land conversion, where natural habitats are changed to serve human uses. The second is water extraction from rivers, lakes, and aquifers. The third is energy production, which requires land, infrastructure, and materials. The fourth is material extraction, removing resources from the earth. The fifth is waste generation, where the outputs of production and consumption re-enter environmental systems. Each pathway connects human need to ecological change in a specific way, and together they account for most of the pressure that biodiversity faces. One of the most direct links between human growth and biodiversity decline is land use change. Forests may be cleared to become farms, mines, roads, or settlements. Wetlands may be drained or filled. Grasslands may be converted to farmlands or pastures, or fragmented into smaller isolated patches. From a human planning perspective, this is often called development. From an ecological perspective, it may mean habitat destruction, fragmentation, and the progressive decline of species that depend on those natural systems. The same process can appear productive in one frame and damaging in another. This is why ecological reasoning must be embedded in developmental decisions from the very beginning, not added as an afterthought. Biodiversity depends not only on land but also on water. Large-scale human demand for fresh water can reduce river flow, degrade wetlands, alter lake systems, and lower groundwater levels. Irrigation draws heavily from rivers and aquifers. Industry and cities also compete for the same limited resources. When flow patterns change, aquatic organisms, riparian vegetation, wetland birds, amphibians, and fish communities can all be affected. Water is not only a resource for people, it is a life support condition that maintains entire ecosystems. And when extraction exceeds what the system can sustain, the ecological consequences spread widely. Energy demand is another major pathway. The image here shows wind farms, often presented as a clean solution, and in many ways they are. But even renewable energy is not ecologically free. Wind installations occupy land. They fragment habitats. They sit directly in the flight path of birds. Large number of birds die colliding with spinning blades. And the constant mechanical noise degrades the surrounding habitat in ways that are easy to ignore, but nonetheless real and persistent. Beyond wind, energy systems also require mines, dams, pipelines, and roads, each leaving its own footprint. So, energy production, renewable or otherwise, has both direct and indirect ecological effects. This is exactly why sustainability analysis matters. We must weigh benefits and ecological costs together, even when the technology feels like progress. Ecological pressure is not only about direct habitat conversion. More production and consumption typically mean more sewage, more plastic waste, more chemical residues, more air pollution, and more solid waste. These waste streams often disperse through air, water, and soil, far from their source. Biodiversity can therefore be affected even in places distant from human activity. Effects may be delayed and easy to overlook at first, but over time, accumulated pollution damages organisms, disrupts food webs, reduces reproductive success, and weakens ecosystem functioning. Here is the core mechanism of this lecture in its simplest form. Human demand increases extraction and land use. That extraction and land use alters ecosystems. Altered ecosystems become less capable of supporting biodiversity. We should be able to narrate this cause and effect chain clearly and confidently. It is the fundamental ecological logic behind most human driven biodiversity threats. Different threats may look different on the surface, but many follow the same basic structure. Understanding the common logic is more powerful than memorizing individual cases. The rhinoceros on this slide tells the story of ecological pressure better than any diagram could. The one-horned rhinoceros was once found across large parts of the Indian subcontinent. Today, it survives mainly in the Brahmaputra Valley and pockets of the Tarai, a dramatic shrinkage of its habitat area. But the rhino is not merely a victim of that shrinkage. As a mega herbivore, it actively maintains the ecosystem around it. It creates and sustains grazing lawns, disperses seeds across wide areas, and digs wallow that hold water and support other species. When rhino populations decline, all of these ecological interactions are disturbed. Other species that depend on those functions begin to follow. The rhino is a sensitive species. It declines first, but its loss sets off a chain. And with each link that breaks, ecosystem resilience weakens a little further. The giant panda on this slide is perhaps the most recognizable specialist in the world. Its diet is almost entirely bamboo, a single plant on which it depends for survival. If bamboo availability declines due to habitat loss or fragmentation, the panda has nowhere else to turn. It cannot simply switch to another food source. This is what makes specialists so vulnerable. They depend on narrow, specific conditions, and when human pressure alters those conditions, they have few or no alternatives. Generalists, by contrast, can shift their diet, behavior, or habitat use more readily. This is why rising pressure changes not just how many species survive, but also which ones. And that distinction shapes the entire ecological character of what remains. Now consider the contrast. The Palash tree shown here is a disturbance tolerant species. It colonizes degraded land, survives fire, and persists in fragmented and disturbed habitats where more sensitive species cannot. When ecological pressure rises, Palash and species like it may actually spread. And here lies the danger. If we measure a landscape's biodiversity only by whether plants and animals are present, we might see Palash flowering brilliantly and conclude that all is well. But community composition has shifted. The sensitive species are gone. The ecological roles they played, the interactions, the structures, the functions, they all have been lost. Biodiversity has declined in every meaningful sense, even when the landscape still looks alive. And this is why species counts alone are never enough. Let us reconnect this lecture to the ideas we developed in week 2. Biodiversity loss is not only a conservation concern. When ecosystems come under sustained pressure, their ability to deliver services weakens. Pollination becomes less reliable. Water regulation deteriorates. Soil stability declines. Climate buffering weakens. And when ecosystem services decline, societies face greater social and economic risk. Agriculture can suffer. Water security can deteriorate. Sustainable development becomes progressively harder when the ecological support systems underpinning it are being eroded by the same pressures that development generates. Food systems depend on soils, water, pollinators, and ecological stability. Settlements depend on local climate regulation, vegetation cover, drainage, and buffering against hazards. Economies depend on reliable natural support systems, even when that dependence is not visible in financial accounts. And there is a fundamental paradox here. Human development frequently draws down the very ecological systems that development itself depends on. And this is why biodiversity must be treated as a foundational infrastructure, not as an optional consideration to be addressed after other priorities. And here is a useful analytical idea. The overall impact of a human society, I, depends on the number of people that are there, P, the level of consumption per person, or the affluence of those people, A, and the technologies and practices that are used to meet that consumption, T. The conceptual point matters more than any other formula. Impact is multi-causal. It cannot be reduced to population alone, or to consumption alone, or to technology alone. Careful environmental analysis asks how these factors interact with each other and with governance systems. And that approach helps us identify where intervention is actually needed. The helicopter on this slide helps fight forest fires. technology in the service of ecological protection. And that is only one phase of technology. But consider the chainsaw, the road roller, the earth mover. In the hands of poorly governed extraction, these can clear a forest in days that took centuries to grow, push roads into the last undisturbed habitats, and flatten landscapes that no restoration effort can easily recover. Technology cuts both ways. It can reduce ecological pressure or dramatically amplify it. What determines the outcome is not the machine itself, but the decisions, institutions, and governance that direct its use. People may consume in one place, while ecological consequences occur somewhere else entirely. Cities depend on distant farms, forests, mines, rivers, and energy systems. Ecological footprints therefore routinely extend far beyond the point where consumption is visible. A person may have absolutely no awareness of the wetland that was drained or the forest that was cleared to supply something they use regularly. This geographical separation between consumption and impact makes biodiversity loss easier to overlook, but it does not make the damage any less real. As food demand rises, societies may expand cropland into natural habitat or intensify production on existing land. Expansion directly reduces habitat area and can fragment ecosystems. Intensification may raise yields but tends to increase chemical inputs, water withdrawal, and pressure on soil organisms and surrounding natural areas. Even within one sector, food production, human demand translates into ecological pressure through multiple simultaneous routes. Expansion and intensification both carry ecological consequences, even if their visible forms differ. Settlements occupy land directly, but their ecological impact extends well beyond the built structures. Roads, utilities, drainage networks, and service corridors spread outward from the core. Peri-urban habitats become fragmented, wildlife movement becomes constrained, landscape connectivity declines, edge effects increase. Urban expansion is therefore not only a social and economic process, it is simultaneously a landscape ecological process with significant and lasting consequences for biodiversity in the surrounding region. Buildings, transport infrastructure, electronics, and consumer goods all depend on raw materials. And those materials must come from somewhere. The image on this slide shows what that somewhere can look like. These are hills near Jaipur, carved apart by quarrying. There is almost no vegetation, almost no soil, just steep, exposed rock that cannot support habitat and cannot easily recover. What was once a living landscape has now been reduced to geometry. Processing, refining, and transporting those materials adds further ecological stress elsewhere. The chain extends from the scarred hillside all the way to the finished product, and the landscape bears the cost. This image of Jodhpur captures ecological pressure in a single glance. Blue houses stretch across the plains and valleys as far as the eye can see. And what remains of the natural landscape are few scattered hills, islands in a sea of settlement. There is no connected habitat, no ecological corridor, no continuity. Everything between the surrounding hills has been converted. And this is what large-scale land conversion looks like from a distance. Not a dramatic event, but a slow, total occupation of space that leaves wildlife with nowhere to go. We should distinguish between direct and indirect ecological effects here. Direct effects are habitat removal, disturbance, and extraction, visible, measurable, and easier to act on. Indirect effects are subtler. Pollution, altered water flows, invasive species spread, and cumulative stress that builds over time. The plant on this slide is Lantana camara, an invasive alien species that illustrates indirect effects well. Lantana thrives in disturbed areas, roadsides, cleared edges, places where native vegetation has been removed. Human infrastructure creates the opening and then lantana moves in. Once established, it spreads steadily, displacing native plants and transforming the habitat for everything that depends on them. Nobody cleared the forest to plant lantana. It arrived as an indirect consequence of disturbance. And this is why management must address both categories. Protecting land from direct clearing is not enough if indirect pressures continue to degrade it from within. The most serious problem in real systems is often cumulative pressure, building over time. A road here, a drained patch there, extraction elsewhere, moderate pollution, repeated disturbance across seasons and years. None of these may seem catastrophic in isolation, but combined, they weaken ecosystem resilience and reduce the recovery capacity. And this is why biodiversity loss often appears gradual at first. The changes accumulate quietly, and by the time the damage becomes visible, the system may already be in an advanced state of decline. Ecosystems can absorb a certain degree of disturbance and still function, but they cannot absorb unlimited stress. At some time, thresholds may be crossed, and decline can then accelerate in ways that are difficult to reverse. Species may disappear locally, water quality may drop sharply, recovery timelines may lengthen or become uncertain. The image on this slide captures the idea well. Like blocks removed one at a time, the system may appear stable until a tipping point is reached, and then the whole tower collapses all of a sudden and without warning. And that is why sustainable development depends on recognizing ecological limits and staying within those limits at all times. Those who consume the most are not always the ones who experience the earliest or most severe ecological harm. Vulnerable communities with fewer resources may face water stress, pollution pressure, or declining ecosystem services long before more affluent groups do. Ecological pressure is therefore not only an environmental question, it is also a social question. Sustainability requires fairness alongside efficiency. Environmental degradation often deepens existing social inequalities rather than affecting everyone equally, and this dimension must not be overlooked. Human population growth does not automatically mean ecological collapse. Outcomes depend on planning quality, on distribution of resources, efficiency of systems, and the strength of governance. We must avoid deterministic thinking. The purpose of this lecture is not to argue that more people inevitably produce more damage. It is to understand the risk pathways and clarify where management is needed. Better choices in design, policy, and governance can meaningfully reduce pressure. Poorly managed growth, on the other hand, can intensify damage much beyond what population numbers alone would suggest. Good planning works to reduce unnecessary land conversion and improve efficiency in water and energy use. So the same services are delivered with less ecological cost. It lowers waste and pollution. It protects critical habitats and ecological flows. And most fundamentally, it tries to align development with ecological capacity. And this is where sustainability moves from concept to practice, asking not only what we want to build, but also how we can do so without undermining the ecological systems that support human life. The lectures that follow will examine specific biodiversity threats in greater detail: habitat loss, fragmentation, degradation, overexploitation, invasive species, and pollution. But many of these scientific threats originate from the same broad source that we examine today: increasing and poorly managed human demand. Today's lecture provides a broader driver framework. The coming lectures will unpack how that pressure translates into scientific specific and well-documented ecological mechanisms. So let us consolidate the key vocabulary of today. Population growth refers to increasing human numbers. Per capita consumption refers to average resource used per person. Ecological pressure refers to the stress placed on ecosystems by human demand. Land conversion means changing natural habitat into another human use. Resource extraction means removing materials, water, energy resources, or biological resources from natural systems. Ecosystem resilience means the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and continue to function, essentially bounce back. These terms will return throughout the course. This slide compresses the full logic of today's lecture. Rising demand leads to more extraction and conversion. That alters habitats and disrupts ecological flows. Altered systems support biodiversity less effectively. Ecosystem services weaken. And as ecosystem services weaken, human vulnerability rises. This is the chain to carry forward. It links ecology, biodiversity, and human sustainability within one integrated framework and gives us a tool for analyzing the consequences of human demand in almost any setting. At this stage, we should have a clear grasp of five things. Population matters. Consumption patterns matter equally. Technology and governance also shape outcomes. Ecological pressure operates through identifiable pathways: land, water, energy, materials, and waste. And biodiversity loss and sustainability loss are not separate problems. The same pressures that weaken ecological systems tend to weaken the conditions for long-term human well-being as well. It's too simple to say that only population numbers matter. It is equally too simple to believe that technology alone will solve the problem. And it is too simple to assume that development and biodiversity are always and necessarily in conflict. Real analysis examines how factors interact, what trade-offs are involved, what institutional quality looks like, and where ecological limits lie. And that is the level of reasoning this course asks you to develop. Human demand creates ecological pressure through land conversion, water extraction, energy systems, material use, and waste generation. Population matters, but consumption patterns matter just as much and must be analyzed along with numbers. Rising population weakens biodiversity and reduces ecosystem resilience. When ecological systems are overburdened, sustainable development becomes progressively harder to achieve. And these are the core messages of today's lecture and the foundation of the lectures that will follow. Let us frame a 4 revision question takeaways. First, you should be able to define human population growth, consumption, and ecological pressure clearly. Second, you should be able to distinguish this framework from simpler or mistaken interpretations, such as the idea that population alone determines impact. Third, you should be able to explain the main mechanisms and pathways that we discussed today. And fourth, you should be able to apply these ideas to real sustainability challenges in conservation policy, land use planning, or development decision making. In the next lecture, we will turn to habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation, one of the most direct and well-documented drivers of biodiversity decline. Today's broad framework of human pressure will become more specific and detailed. The pathways we identified today, particularly land conversion and infrastructure spread, will come into sharp focus in that session. Before we close, let us pause for one reflection question. How can the ideas discussed in this lecture help us understand or address a real sustainability challenge? Consider local environments you are familiar with, governance decisions you have observed, or livelihoods that depend directly on ecological systems. Think about whether both population and consumption are part of the challenge that you have in mind and which pressure pathways are the most relevant. This reflection connects the concepts from today's lecture to complex decisions that sustainability practice actually involves. And that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.